Thank you, Mr. Morales. I appreciate you bringing the Caldecott up. As you know, I have a long history. It's nice to actually, I guess it's nice to be old enough and been in office long enough to remember the inception of something that I was very involved with, and then actually be there at opening day. And I don't know how many times I've used that tunnel now going westbound from my home into San Francisco or Oakland, but I will say that I make a point of slowing down and going through the new one every time. I've yet to be through the middle one, just because I enjoy it so much. And in regards to that, this sort of segues to questions. So you mentioned our hearing on mega projects, and we're going to hear from Professor Ibbs, who was part of that. And I took some of the information from Professor Flyborg and how we Skyped in his assistant. So in that conversation, interestingly enough, their research, if memory serves me, is that mega projects in all of their research were 4 times above the original engineers' estimates. But the 2 categories where they said in their research went beyond that were 4.5 times above. And those were tunnels, the Caldecott. And the Caldecott's example, it was actually done on time and on budget. So it's not as if it has to be 4 times. But his research indicated that the average was around the industrialized world was 4.5 times. And the other one was high-speed rail. I don't know if you had a chance to hear the hearing, but I thought it was terrific. It was very non-political, non-emotive, just the facts. So, I mean, when you look at risk management, I think that obviously would send flags up to somebody in my position, because if we're at $68 billion for the total build-out of the project, that would put us upwards of over $300 billion if that followed. So would you care to comment, and what kind of risk management will we include, given that we know this history from the rest of the world when it comes to these projects?
Sure. And I and others on our team certainly did watch the hearing and found it very interesting. We've also been working directly with Professor, and I'll leave the pronunciation to you, Flyberg, and his team.
I think that's the anglicized.
Yes. Working to understand their findings and how to apply their lessons learned. You also had at that hearing, I think, another important, I wouldn't say opposing view, but a slightly different view from the Omega Center in London that had some different findings and came to some different conclusions. But I think the fundamental question is still, a sound one of how, on any major program, how do you protect against cost growth? How do we ensure that we're moving forward based on the best information available to us? And I think it's important to note that we've gone through a process that very few other projects have, and we've come out of it with scores that very few other projects have. And that was an almost year-long review by the Government Accountability Office that was requested by Congress to look at our processes for everything from demand modeling to cost estimation. And their conclusions were that we are using state-of-the-art practices for that estimation. We are intentionally conservative in our approach to estimating in the form of keeping higher contingency levels in the estimates, updating the estimates on a regular basis. We feel to date good in that our first estimate, the first construction contract that came in well below our estimates, which obviously there are many factors at play in an estimate and in a bid price, but it suggests that at least there our estimates are on track and even conservative. But we're going to continue to go through the process of updating the estimates, bringing into date latest information, latest techniques. We're using Monte Carlo analyses on virtually all of our forecasts and assumptions to try to eliminate uncertainty in our estimates. And that's, again, something that not many projects do.
In relation to the risk management, and you as being a former Caltrans director, and as it goes to your comments about the eastern span of the Bay Bridge, the context of those comments on their quality assurance and risk management was more about what they learned and how they adapted to it, actually after the period when you were director of Caltrans. And there's no criticism at the early part. It's just it was a huge project. And in hindsight, I certainly would have done my role in that bridge would have been, I would have made different decisions. But in that regard, I mean, one of my largest concerns about the way we're going about it now, and the red flag when I heard things, and I recognize the Omega Group, but we spent a good deal of time both reading Professor Flyberg's book and then reading the research on both sides, and honest people can disagree. But when you have the CTC telling this committee that we're $300 billion short on our needs for the operations of our current infrastructure, and a lot of us are trying to figure out how we can get the public to buy into some kind of sustainable revenue source, given that the ARA funds are gone, the bond funds are gone that the voters have previously approved, and that the gas tax is changing dramatically because of legislation that we have passed through this building. So one of my greatest concerns, and we talk about an integrated transportation system, and you have talked about this throughout your career, which certainly I'm sure brings concerns to you given the finiteness of taxpayers' ability to fund our unmet needs in this state. It's just, it continues to concern me that, and I think this is reflective as I read what the judges said, Judge Kinney in his proceedings, and what's required under Ms. Galgiani's language that the voters approved, is that while the business plan, I think, continues to be, as you modify it, continues to be more robust, but it still leaves a lot of assumptions that in my previous career in the restaurant business, having enjoyed a sort of weird avocation of reading pro formas in that career and profit and loss statements, I mean, with all due respect, you couldn't get a business loan for a small business based on what we're assuming here. So that's a long way of asking, as someone who believes in an integrated transportation system in all of your life, I'm sure you share the concerns of myself and others that these are big moving targets and we've got to get them right, including for high-speed rail to work, as we've got to continue to maintain and operate the freeway system. So when you look at risk management, do you look at it not just in cost containment for the project, but the potential reliance on more subsidies yet to be identified for the project from the general fund or local sales tax or other public sources?
I want to make sure we clarify the term subsidy, because I think that, there's an important distinction in this, and particularly with regard to our system. If we're talking capital funding, yes, we obviously anticipate additional capital funding. I think subsidy, certainly in the sense of an operating subsidy, is not in our equation. It's not allowed under 1A, and our business plan shows clearly that we will not need one and will not seek one and don't need one. So I just want to make sure we're using the same term, subsidy. The question of capital need is a pressing one, whether we're talking about highway maintenance, rail investment, airport maintenance, anything. And I think it's having been in this field for my whole career, I'm very concerned about what's happening nationally. Certainly the fact that Congress has let there is no rail program in place nationally. The highway and transit program is about to expire with no solution, and the Highway Trust Fund is about to go broke. The needs are huge out there, but I think part of what I believe, certainly and surveys show it. There was a poll that just was released last night by the Public Policy Institute, which...
Wonderful timing for this hearing.
We have nothing to do with it. But I think it conveyed some important thing, which is this investment in particular, and infrastructure of investment in general, and certainly this program is about the future. It's about the economy. It's about competitiveness of the state going forward. And they are investments. They pay off, and they have all sorts of benefits to the economy. Part of the risk management approach to our program is to look at then how we can deliver the program in stages and in sections, usable segments, as defined under 1A, so that we can deliver benefits without having to have all the funding in hand. And I think an important distinction people need to keep in mind, ours is not a project, it's a program. We're building a series of lines. It's really in many ways akin to if we were starting to build the state highway system today. It's that extensive in its reach, and it can operate, have segments of it that can operate independently and then ultimately all tie together. So, part of that risk management approach is to look at what resources are available and how we can move forward judiciously with any given segment and produce value for the taxpayer.
I appreciate that. Just a couple more. So when obviously the committee's aware you're in litigation right now nearby in Superior Court, without you handicapping it directly, are you very confident that you're going to move out of the first phase of that this is sufficient? Certainly being somewhat skeptical, not just about this project, but just being older and been in politics a long time. As I've read the judge's comments and I look at the business plan, I'm somewhat skeptical that it really suffices. So in terms of a timeline, without divulging what your strategy is to your opponents, how confident are you that you're going to be moving past this, and any other comments you care to share that are appropriate?
Sure. Well, I would say, we've always been confident we've been moving ahead in good faith with the law and in compliance with it. As far as the process, those matters are now before the 3rd District Court of Appeal on an expedited basis. We don't know yet what the timing is of what their next steps will be in terms of either oral argument or perhaps a ruling, other than they were given direction from the state Supreme Court to expedite the process, and they certainly have done so to date. So we're hopeful we will get resolution of those quickly.
On the governor's proposal in the budget, one of the reasons we wanted to hold this hearing now is for all of the members here to start to be conscious of the implications of it. So from having spent a long time as a member of the Air Resources Board, where I first met you, although we were just at the beginning phases of dealing with climate change and carbon as Senator Pavley's bills moved through the legislature. Certainly concern to me, and maybe you could address this, about the potential nexus and potential litigation if the legislature does approve that, whether it's legal to spend that amount of money, and what kind of reductions in the early phases and then at completion in carbon reductions will your program, as you mentioned it, actually give the state that's consistent with AB 32?
On the eligibility question, I would first and foremost defer to the ARB on that. As I believe you know, since passage of AB 32, high-speed rail has been identified as a priority investment in the scoping plan going back to 2008. So well in advance of even Prop 1A coming on. So I think that question, as far as we know, it's a perfectly legitimate and appropriate use. We think it's a very appropriate use for the greenhouse gas reducing qualities that this system can have. Just some big picture things in Europe they've found, and they have statistics showing that high-speed rail there emits about 1/9 the emissions of airplanes. And one of the important aspects of high-speed rail as it gets up and running is the mode shift that occurs, and that has been demonstrated all over the world, where prior to the introduction of high-speed rail between city pairs like Madrid and Barcelona, or London and Paris, aviation had 80% or so of the market, and after high-speed rail was introduced, that flipped, and now you see 80% or so of travel, and up to 90% in the Madrid-Seville market, I believe it is, going by train. We even see that here in the Northeast Corridor with the introduction of the Acela service, which was a significant leapfrog from the existing Amtrak service, which is still there, where they went from 37% of the market up to now 78% of the market going on the Acela service. So that kind of mode shift has a major impact on reduction of greenhouse gases. We submitted a report to the legislature last summer that was required under SB 1029 on the greenhouse gas reduction potential, and we spoke to a lot of this, but I just give you a sense that initially, during the construction phase, we're doing a lot of things to reduce greenhouse gases, even during construction, and we estimate between 278 to 674,000 metric tons can be reduced by 2020. And then once we're up and running, ultimately, just by looking at the mode shift of people going from either, whether it's car or airplane, into high-speed rail, ultimately something on the order of 2 million metric tons being reduced a year. You know, I would say that, as is the case with transit generally, I think we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg, though, when we talk about reductions, because part of the benefit of investing in a system like this is we help change land use patterns. We help make transit-oriented development more possible. And so you get a far greater impact of all of those other things that are facilitated in part by high-speed rail and connecting services. And there have been estimates for reductions, multiples, magnitudes of order greater because of those sort of complementary things that come into play once we have these systems in place.
It's just switching to jobs a little bit. So you have filled positions within the organization, but as the background paper alludes to, one of the things that I know a lot of my colleagues voted in support of the authorization was we needed jobs, particularly in the Valley. I remember then Senator Rubio, we've almost forgotten him already, talking passionately on the floor about 40% unemployment out in the Valley. When is your expectation that we'll actually start putting working people to work and starting fulfilling that promise that there would be jobs, construction jobs?
The greatest number of jobs will come as we get into heavy construction. Obviously, that's true of any project, but we're already, through this program, employing large numbers of people, and particularly Californians. Our design builder already has 27 small businesses under contract. All of those small businesses are California-based, most of them in the Central Valley. We have, I believe, the numbers, and I'd be happy to provide this for the committee for the record. There are, I believe, over almost 6,700 people today working on the program in various aspects, getting ready to do the full-blown delivery. And so even short of being in heavy construction, we are producing economic benefits in the Central Valley, in those troubled areas. And the long term, it will be not just the construction jobs that come in, but one of the very important aspects of this program is also it's an unprecedented investment in the Central Valley and in the economy of the Central Valley, and will help diversify that economy, because that 15% or so unemployment rate that you see in the Central Valley has been stuck there for a very, very long time, and something needs to change it. And allowing greater access to the job market, allowing other types of companies beyond agriculture to move in, will be facilitated by our system.
Just I want to wrap up because I want to move things along, and I appreciate your being here and the tone of the conversation. So if the legislature doesn't approve the authorization that the governor's asked for in cap and trade, what do you foresee? What is the impact for the program?
Well, let me talk a little bit about what approval means first, because I think it's important to understand that when Prop 1A was passed, obviously it provided, when you work through the numbers, it's about $8 billion that's available for construction of the high-speed system because of the connectivity money and then design and environmental and other things. What was not provided was an ongoing source of funding, like a gas tax type thing for construction of the highway system. The governor's proposal is really intended to allow us to move the program forward with certainty, to move forward and engage firms on a long-term basis, to keep the program moving. And if we can accelerate the program, it saves money. Compressing that time saves money. If you look at our cost estimates, in current year dollars, they're about $52 billion. There's $68 billion in year of expenditure. So that's $16 billion that's just tied to time, time of delivery. So anything we can do to compress that time and get this program up and running faster saves money for people. Part of the idea behind the proposal is to be able to create an ongoing source of funding so that we can then leverage that and bring in other money and make it possible. If we don't have that, we can't do all of those things, at least not without an alternative source. And so we would be looking at how we can take advantage, certainly leverage the Prop 1A money we have, the federal funds we have, continue to look at ways of bringing private investment in as soon as possible to move the program forward. But we would not have the same kind of certainty that we would have with the governor's proposal.
I assume we're going to have this conversation about the cap-and-trade funds leveraging new money. Do you have any kind of indication that there is new money to be leveraged? From what I read, on the federal level, there's not a high likelihood of the current Congress allocating another appropriation for these kind of projects. I have not read or seen anything where the private sector has moved towards participating. Do you have any indication in writing or in public meetings that there is new money available, a potential to leverage?
There are several sources. I think the distinction here is between grant-type funds and financing. The federal government has been, for better or worse, moving away from grants and outright, providing funds to moving more in the area of financing with programs like Garvey and TIFIA, and in the rail area, something called the Railroad Rehabilitation Investment Fund, RIF. Those programs all have capacity and are available. We certainly are looking at those as sources. They're authorized programs that exist and, again, have the capacity to do them. I will say on the private side, we continue to talk to the private sector, to whether it's concessionaires, developers, investors, bankers. There's very strong interest. And at the appropriate time, I'm very confident that they will participate. But the question is at what point and under what conditions, and we're just not there yet.
Oh, I don't mean to change the tenor of this pleasant conversation. We have been told this over and over again, that this potential is coming very soon. I've heard it in this hearing room. It was actually in this hearing room that for the first time I publicly changed my position on the project because of the inability of your predecessors to identify funding. So is there anything specific that tells you, have you had meetings? Is there any public testimony? Are there letters that indicate to you? And then you know what the total amounts are in those federal grant procedures? I mean, is there real money there that administratively can be approved? As
an example, in the RIF program, I believe there's something like $35 billion in capacity that's available. The TIFIA program is, I would have to get back to you on the figures, but I know the last reauthorization doubled or tripled the size of that. They're very large programs. Yes. Yeah.
So on the ability of other money besides that, private sector money, any indication at all, other than the hope that someone will become interested? So, sorry, Mr. Jeff, Mr. Morales, what I'm trying to get to is on the cap-and-trade funds, we will be having this discussion as the budget heats up, and personally, as I view the legislature, I think you've got a huge challenge, and the administration does, to get the necessary votes to appropriate the funds. So I'm anticipating that what we're going to be told is you need the funds for purposes of the litigation and being able to demonstrate real sustainable funds, both to the court and to the public, but to the legislature. And the argument for that, part of the argument for that will be what you just said, is leveraging other funds. But we've been told that before, so at some point, as the background paper says in mega projects, you have to reconsider what you're doing. So for me, it would be nice to have an honest discussion about this so that we really have an honest discussion here in this building about the risk implicit in authorizing $250 million out of revenue for cap and trade that I believe probably could be done a little more, much more targeted, and I agree with the LAO's estimation. We'll hear from them later in the next panel. So the question is, and we will hear from you, I'm sure, in the next few months during the budget discussion, where is that other money coming from with a degree of specificity that heretofore we haven't heard from, and I assume, my assumption is the court's going to want to hear about.
I won't speak to the latter point, but what we can do is identify certainly the menu of options and run a number of different scenarios, because at the end of the day, what option we can implement will depend on the nature of the commitment in terms of amount and time. You know, just as, and in that regard, it's really no different than, you know, you going to buy a house. You know, you can, what size mortgage you can get and what terms will depend on, you know, what your job is at the time and other circumstances. So, you know, there are options out there. There are, and we can provide, I think, much greater specificity, still obviously on a prospective basis to you than maybe you've seen before in terms of those options.
So,
yes.
Just so we are understanding, if you can provide us with a, let's use the metaphor of buying a house,
right,
under the current standards, by the way. So if you could provide us with more specificity
sure.
to the committee, I think the earlier you can give us that and the legislature can share that in the budget process, personally, I think if you can give that to us, you have a higher degree of probability of getting the necessary votes. I think if all of this were held closely to the vest until the end, I think you'll, just my own reading of my colleagues, and certainly my feeling, and you've got a very steep road to convince me to vote for the appropriations, just to be honest. The higher degree of specificity with a spreadsheet and application for a home loan would be helpful sooner rather than later.
Very good. We'd be happy to.
I think that's probably a good place for us to stop this discussion. I appreciate you coming, and I understand you're going to be around if other colleagues join and there are subsequent questions. It would be helpful to have you here.
Absolutely.
Okay.